Welcome to Bite the Talk, a podcast hosted by the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, known as GAIN. Join us as we discuss all things food systems related: diets, nutrition, environment, health, you name it. Meet fascinating people working in the nutrition and food community. Tune in to Bite the Talk and let's explore together.
Hello and welcome to Bite the Talk, where we unpack the big ideas and bold commitments shaping global food systems. I'm your host, Mark Gachagua. Now today we are diving deep into something incredibly important, the Zero Hunger Private Sector Pledge and its newly released 2025 Accountability Report that examines the deployment of company pledges in 2023 and 2024. This is one of the biggest global efforts to mobilize private sector investments towards ending hunger and malnutrition. And the latest data gives us a powerful sense of what's working, what's not working, and what needs to happen next. To help us break it down, I'm joined by two leaders who know the pledge quite well. First, I'm happy to welcome Carin, the Executive Director of Shamba Center for Food and Climate. Now, Carin is a globally respected policy leader, a co-architect of the Zero Hunger Pledge, and one of the key designers of the accountability framework. Her work on Ceres 2030 provided the evidence base for the pledge's 10 priority investment areas, and she continues to guide governments, companies, and global platforms towards more sustainable food systems. Carin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here.
And joining us is Dr. Lauren Sadat, the Executive Director of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition and a leading driver behind the creation and scaling of the Zero Hunger Pledge. Now, Lawrence has championed accountability and transparency from the start and has helped steer this global effort through a period of major change and uncertainty. Lawrence, it's always good to have you on the podcast.
Good to be here, Mark, with Carin as well.
Thank you very much. Carin, allow me to start with you. For listeners who may not know, what exactly is the Zero Hunger Private Sector Pledge?
Thanks, Mark. So as you introduced, the Zero Hunger Private Sector Pledge was a way for companies to meaningfully contribute to efforts to eradicate hunger and poverty. It emerged in 2021 at the UN Food Systems Summit. It was a very different time then, and spirits were very high and hope was very high. We had just emerged out of the pandemic, and it was really a recognition that governments alone can't solve this problem of hunger and malnutrition, and the private sector needs to get more involved. It was also a time when there was growing consensus around how to end hunger and malnutrition. A lot of evidence had come out that said, okay, this is the roadmap, this is what it looks like, this is what we need to do. So it was a great way to galvanize the energy of governments, civil society, private sector, and international organizations to finally eradicate hunger and malnutrition. We used this report called Ceres 2030 that you mentioned in your introduction that I was part of, that was basically the roadmap and the bill that we needed to end hunger, double the incomes and productivity of small-scale farmers, and do all this while still staying within our 1.5 degree commitment that had been made a few years earlier at the Paris climate talks. It asks companies to make financial commitments, to invest in 10 areas that emerged from that report that are seen as the most high impact areas to end hunger and malnutrition. And it asked them to invest not just in these 10 areas, but in the 90 odd countries who had not yet succeeded in eradicating hunger and malnutrition. So that was the pledge.
Oh, nice. And I like what we have heard about the pledge, and accountability seems to be, centered on the pledge, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been lots and lots of pledges made over the years, and we didn't want to repeat some of the mistakes of previous pledges and just make it about pledging. We wanted the pledges to actually be implemented in countries and on the ground. And we realized that making a pledge is easy. Honoring a pledge is a whole nother ball game. So we wanted to make sure there was a really strong mechanism within the pledge when Lawrence and I designed it that would mean that companies couldn't just get away with the pledge and then leaving. So we have this mechanism where every 2 years we hire independent consultants to basically verify the status of all the pledges, to find out how much of the company's pledge has actually been deployed, what types of projects they were used to deploy it, and particularly what countries, because we wanted to make sure the money was flowing to the countries that needed it most. We also wanted to use this accountability mechanism to understand a bit better what's working, but also what's not. We wanted to hear as much the success stories as the failures.
Good. And that reflects very well even in the report, what's working, what's not working. For example, the report opens with a striking level of, I think honesty, acknowledging the declining global, solidarity, companies stepping back from sustainability, and a general sense of, what's happening in the world and the crisis that we are witnessing. Carin, why do you and the team choose to set this tone in the report?
Yeah, good question. Yes, we do start with a pretty grim tone. And I think we did that because, let's face it, this is how we're all feeling right now. The daily headlines that we are reading when we wake up every morning is about how more and more companies are giving up on their commitments. We saw, I think, most prominently the Net Zero Banking Alliance breaking up. So all the big banks basically giving up on their net zero climate commitments. We've also seen the insurance companies give up on their net zero commitments, asset managers. So whilst we're seeing this global picture, we wanted to acknowledge that this is what's happening, that we're in a very different world today than we were when we launched this pledge. And it's not a given anymore that companies want to be part of these movements. It's also not a given that governments want to be part of these global movements to end hunger and poverty anymore. In the last 12 months, but more so in the last 24 months, we've seen most rich countries slash their aid budgets. We saw very shockingly and very rapidly the US closing their aid agency. It really seems like there's a backtracking. And what I think we wanted to show in this report is we acknowledge this broader context, but we have some good news to tell within it, because the 100-odd companies that are part of our pledge are not reneging on their commitments. And actually, in our report, you must have read it, but 5 companies actually overspent beyond the commitment that they had made. So they went above and beyond. I was just reading this morning a new report a new paper from the Harvard Business Review that was also giving me a bit more optimism. And it was saying, yes, the headlines look bad, but they looked at 75 big multinational companies, all publicly listed companies, and looked at their track record based on their ESG, environmental, social, governance commitments, including their climate commitments. And it was interesting because they found that only about 15% of the companies, the 75 big companies that they looked at, were actually reneging. The vast majority have either stalled or are continuing to engage. They're just not being loud about it. So there might be a little underbelly story that we're not hearing in the headlines, but that is happening, where companies are maybe not loudly talking about what they're doing, but are continuing to make these investments, continuing to make these commitments, continuing to support these kinds of initiatives. So I'm actually, after having been part of this accountability report, I'm a lot more hopeful than I have been reading the headlines.
Yeah, thank you, Carin. And there's a silver lining to every cloud, right? Lawrence, I was just wondering, you have a lot of experience in this industry. Obviously, you're quite familiar with the pledge. What stood out for you in this report?
Thank you, Mark. It's always good to listen to Carin. I'm always inspired by her. So thank you, Carin, for your passion. You know what I really was encouraged by was the increases in the commitments on those 5 companies. Now, we have over 100 companies in the pledge, so 5 doesn't sound like a very big number, but it's actually really hard to increase your commitments in a time that it's not just an economic downturn, it's a kind of almost a spiritual or emotional downturn as well. So I think what Carin is saying about companies doing things quietly is right. That was the thing that really stood out for me, even in this really difficult time, really difficult. It's not just about aid, it's about trade, it's about interest rates, it's about debt repayments, it's about uncertainty that comes with the geopolitical, daily geopolitical lurches from over there to over there. That's terrible for business. But even with all of that mayhem going on, there's 5 companies, and some of them big companies, are able to increase their pledges. And that was the original vision of the pledge. We don't want the pledge to be something super difficult for companies to engage with. We're not asking them to move mountains. We're saying, where are you currently working geographically, and where are you currently working in the food system? Let's map where you are working geographically and in the food system to see how hunger reducing your actions are. And then once we know that, that's great, but can you do more? And I think for the first time we did the assessment, 5 companies are doing more. And if we can get to a stage where half of them are doing more, we're really in business. What also gives me hope from the report is the report's 100 plus companies, but there are over 3 million companies that employ more than 20 people operating in Africa right now in the food system. 3 million. Companies employ more than 20 people. These are formalized companies operating in Africa in the food system. That's a huge potential for scaling. So I'm really encouraged by the report. How do we get from millions to billions? I think most initiatives grow slowly and they show an inflection point at some point, and then they take off. Like every trend, every fashion, every initiative, it takes a while for people to catch on, and it takes a while for people to want to get onto the bandwagon. And I think the pledge is a wagon that's easy to get onto. I think it's got a very clear, as Carin said, a very clear roadmap with Sarah's 2030. I think the roadmap is only going to become more impactful with the new evidence piece that Carin and colleagues are working on called HESAT. I think it's only going to speed up. So I'm really optimistic. I think the future of the pledge is probably, the global part is important, and we need to keep that, we need to maintain that work, but probably we need to intensify the work at the country level, especially in countries with high levels of hunger. The pledge is, it's one part of the solution. It can't be the whole solution, right? Because companies are not going to work in countries or in regions in countries where the market just isn't functioning, or where people just cannot get to the market because of conflict and crisis. So the pledge is only going to ever be a part of the solution. Governments have to make it easier for companies to make the pledge. They have to improve the infrastructure of markets, roads. They have to invest in ag R&D, and they have to guarantee the peace, or try to guarantee the peace. So they have a role to play, and the companies are never going to provide kind of emergency assistance like social protection. So governments have a big role to play. We know that. But I think what this report shows is that private sector is playing a big role and can play an even bigger role.
Thank you, Lawrence. And, speaking of numbers and keeping up with the theme, Carin, do you mind taking us through the big findings of the report? What did the 2023 and 2024 accountability cycle reveal?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. So just to nerd in a bit and just give you a few numbers. So we've got around just over 100 companies that have pledged. They have collectively pledged, including this overcommitment that we got in the last reporting period, $800 million. And they've pledged that $800 million in 50 odd priority countries. So what we did was we apply our reporting mechanism to all companies that have pledged more than $1 million. And that's roughly a quarter of the companies. So 24 out of the companies, out of the 100 odd companies, have pledged more than $1 million. And then the others, We are a mix of micro, small, and medium-sized companies, and they can self-report to us, but they're not made to undergo the more rigorous independent verification. So we looked at that quarter, the 24. 16 participated in the report. 4 of them are a bit new, so haven't reported yet. 4, unfortunately, didn't report, 2 of which we are removing from the pledge because they have now not reported for 2 years, so that's part of the bad news. But of those that did report, we basically found that in the last cycle, the last 2 years, they've deployed $214 million of our total. This is our second reporting cycle, so it goes on top of the first 2-year reporting cycle. So we're now basically at around $440 million that's been deployed already out of our $800 million total. So we're roughly half the way there, which is pretty good news. Now, the other good news from our point of view is that most of these investments are not charitable investments. We didn't want the pledge to be about companies giving out charity. We wanted this pledge to be about driving more private sector investment in the areas and in the countries that needed it most. We didn't want this to be a charity handout exercise. And the good news is that 80% of the pledge commitments are what we call core business investments. So 80% of what companies commit is because they're saying, this makes business sense for us. We're not doing this out of the goodness of our hearts. We're doing it because it makes business sense. And that's exactly the type of private sector engagement we wanted to be tapping into. We have in our areas, we basically have these 10 high impact areas where companies can invest in, and they're roughly organized around 3 what we call buckets. So the first is all your on-farm investments to improve infrastructure on the farm, like irrigation, electrification, roads, productivity improvements through better seeds and fertilizers. So that's our one bucket. We have our market type interventions, helping improve cold storage units in markets so that perishable foods can last longer, or helping connect rural areas to market infrastructure. So we've got our market investments, and then we've got what we call empowering the excluded, but it's all those investments that are about helping the consumer get access to the food that's being provided in the marketplace. And for me, the other piece of good news is that roughly half the money is going into those on-farm investments, absolutely critical to making sure the productive base is working. The other roughly half is going into the market-based interventions. And a small pie is going into that, what we call empowering the excluded, but those more consumption-related interventions. Now, some people might say that sounds bad, like surely there should be companies more involved at that consumption level. But actually, that consumption level is very much a public sector role of providing social protection or school meals or food vouchers. So we're not sure how much private sector involvement we want in those types of programs. We want much more private sector involvement in the market and on the farm. The bad side is, as I said, not all of our companies have reported, and 2 of them are being removed from the pledge as of January. But the bigger sort of bad news is that only 3% of the money that was deployed was going to our highest priority countries. So the really poorest countries, the low-income countries. And instead what we see, and many people would say this is quite unsurprising, is that it's easier for the private sector to go to the middle-income countries because the markets there are more developed and more advanced and there's more opportunities. So I think really what I would say a major finding for us to be thinking about doing more is really seeing how we can get more private sector involvement in those really poor, the lowest income countries.
Sure, and I agree with you, Carin. And in fact, I want to request Lawrence to talk about this more, because having only 3% of the projects being in the high priority countries, that's a major gap. Lawrence, when you hear 3%, what does that spark in you?
Yeah, I think it's not 2 reflections. First of all, there are lots of poor and hungry people in lower middle income countries. You think of big countries, big populations, even countries like India, Indonesia, Nigeria, Pakistan, these have lots and lots of poor people in them. There may be a small percentage of the population, but because the populations are so big, absolutely, there are large numbers of hungry people in those countries. So that's the first thing. Second thing, it's not really surprising that the poorest, the most fragile contexts don't attract a lot of private sector investment, because of uncertainty, because of, worries about investment and risk and insurance and all that sort of stuff. But the point is here that governments can change that. I've been working with my GAIN colleagues with Somalia. Somalia is one of the most fragile places around, very poor. But the Somalian government is making a big, big effort to mobilize resources, international resources. It's doing all the things it can do to create the enabling environment for governments to come in. It's adopting responsible policies, it's promoting accountability, it's investing in data, it's preparing investment cases that are financeable, it's reaching out to the financiers, it's involving them in the development of the investments. So yes, we'd like companies to invest more in the poorest countries, but the poorest countries themselves can do something to attract the investment. And we shouldn't be too dismissive of investments in lower middle income countries, because some of the bigger countries still contain very large pockets of poverty and hunger.
I think it's a well-known government responsibility, especially when we talk about business. It's their duty to make sure that there's what we call an enabling environment for the private sector to thrive. So thank you very much. Let's shift the gears a bit and talk about the areas, Carin, where we are seeing more investments coming out. The report shows where companies are putting their money. It's very specific about that. What are the top investment areas, Carin?
So as I mentioned before, what we're seeing is roughly half the money, about 100 million, is going on the farm, which is exactly where we want to see money going, to improving that productivity, moving farmers out of subsistence into more commercially oriented farming. Another just under half going into these market investments, helping to improve food loss and waste, helping to keep foods longer shelf lives by having better storage and market infrastructure. And then a small amount going to this, as I said, this consumer protection, school meals or social protection, but not necessarily where we're wanting to see the private sector too busy. It's really in the market where we want to see strong private sector participation and in helping build that productive capacity on the farm.
Thank you, Carin. And Lawrence, why do you think reducing post-harvest loss is getting so much traction nowadays?
Well, I think food loss is one of those things that's everyone's business, but nobody's responsibility in a way. Individual companies can do a lot to minimize food loss in the part of the value chain that they control, that's under their watch. And they have a very strong incentive to do that, right? Because it affects their bottom line. They use less resources, less inputs. It's just less wasted resources. It also feeds into their emissions ambitions, because food loss is essentially wasted emissions. So it makes sense from a bottom line, economic bottom line, climate accounting perspective for a company. But food loss is a bit like water traveling through a pipe. You can slow down the water loss from a pipe by filling in all the holes. But if there's one hole in the pipe, the water's going to get out. And it's really, government has a big role to play really in working with all the private sector actors throughout the food value chain to try to figure out how to minimize overall loss, because some of the infrastructure is under private control, but some of it's under public control. And the infrastructure that's under the public control needs to be good enough to prevent food loss. And I think this is where the analogy with the pipe and the water breaks down, because when there's a leak from a pipe, there's an urgent need to fix it because the water is damaging property. It's affecting directly the quality of life of the people living below the floor. But when there's food loss in a value chain, there isn't that sense of urgency because the corrosion, the degradation that occurs because of that is cumulative and slow and is not easy to see, and it's not easy to pinpoint the blame, if you like. So I think food loss is one of those things where it makes sense for companies to really invest in and minimize what they can minimize. But it only works up to a point because the whole system has to be food loss prevention proofed. The whole system has to work in coherence to try and prevent food loss. And I think this shows the beautiful duality of government and private sector working together. And, the pledge, I was sad that 2 companies had to leave the pledge, but I was really pleased that we removed them from the pledge because we can't have free riding. We are not under any illusions that the private sector is uniformly wonderful. We know that different private sector players have different levels of performance and different levels of commitment, just as most governments have different levels of performance and different levels of commitment. So I was very pleased that the businesses were removed, those 2 businesses were removed because we had to. But just like everything that makes sense, everything that's worthwhile, you need stakeholders from different perspectives coming together. And I think the food system framing that we use for the pledge, which is crystallized in the Ceres 2030 approach, really shows the importance of different stakeholders working together in a farm to fork perspective. And I really agree with Carin I'm really pleased with the allocation across the 3 areas of company investments. Just under half in business and on farm, just under half off farm, and a little bit in the consumer space. We don't really want the companies meddling in that space. They have expertise in guiding consumers towards things that are profitable, but the things that are profitable are typically, the overlap with nutritious is minimal, really, for many companies. So I think the allocation's really good. Food loss and food waste, as I said, is kind of a no-brainer, but companies can only do so much without governments coming in.
Thank you, Lawrence. And I like the analogy you shared earlier about the water and the pipe. Coming back to you and, talking about outcomes. First of all, I want to thank you together with your team for being innovative with this report and all the work that has gone behind it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think for the first time, companies were asked to report on outcome indicators and not just investment numbers. What did you learn from this shift?
Yeah, exactly. So basically what we were trying to do here is say, okay, we don't just want to be a pledging platform where people come and make pledges and then don't implement their commitments. But we also don't just want to be a tick you've implemented and you've spent your money and now there's nothing more for us to do. We wanted to go that extra mile and say, okay, did the money you spend actually lead to any positive outcomes on our hunger, malnutrition, climate indicators? And that's a bit where this part came through. Now, I have to be completely honest, we did not do a full impact evaluation. We did not have the resources or the time. It would have taken years to do a proper impact evaluation. We would have needed to start off with a baseline condition, then monitor the deployment of the money over the years, and then gone and reviewed it. So we're still not fully reporting on outcomes in the way that all of us would dream to in our space, but we're trying to push companies to report back to us on, is any of this money that's being spent actually leading to something good? That's kind of what we were trying to do. And I think we've learned quite a lot. So the first thing is that a number of companies did actually report back to us on these impact indicators. Some of it was verified independently, most of it was not. So it's really anecdotal at this stage, and I would not rely on this to say, yes, I'm completely confident that this outcome actually was achieved. But I think there was certainly quite a strong engagement on the side of the companies to say we do want to show that we are achieving impact and not just making profits and spending money. You know, we had a great story from one of the companies that was helping improve pumpkin value chains in Uganda by giving Ugandans not just hybrid or higher performing seeds, but also working with them on better production methods, better marketing methods, better storage methods to try and build up this pumpkin value chain. We had another company that was operating in an area that suffered multiple droughts, and they were again using hybrid seeds, trying to basically improve the uptake of drought-resistant fruit and vegetable seeds so that farmers wouldn't lose all of their production if the drought hit. So there we've got really interesting stories. On the one hand, the pumpkin story, where we've got farmers who are making better income, eating better because they're adding pumpkin to their diets, improving the nutritional quality of their diets. And then on the other hand, a story about adapting to climate change, right? It's not just about the farm sector reducing their greenhouse gas emissions and contributing to, the 1.5 degree target, but also about helping farmers adapt to climate change, because let's face it, it's those small scale farmers that are the first victims, that are one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So I think we've got some good stories there. We're really at the beginning. It is really anecdotal at this point, but I think it's moving us away from just pledging to impact.
I love the pumpkin story. I love pumpkins myself, so that's really nice. And sticking with the impact indicators, Lawrence, from your perspective, how transformative can this be?
I think whenever you ask anyone, whether they're a company or a government or a little NGO or just anyone, what's your indicator of what does impact look like to you? You go through a process of clarification and making something meaningful, and you really connect with what you're trying to do. And so I think trying to specify the indicators that we'd ideally like to move, and then the indicators that we can actually practically move, is absolutely critical. And anything we can do to get from pledging to commitment to action to impact, that's what we're all about, impact. Carin's right, though. I mean, it will be a challenge to measure the impact in a classical with and without, before and after, difference and difference kind of assessment. That's the gold standard. But it's, of course, very difficult to do that conceptually and practically. But also, with the resources we have available, you have to remember that this pledge is essentially being run on a shoestring. I think the budget, Carin, is about $150,000 a year. And if you do a very, really crude benefit cost ratio, so it's actually not that crude. If you do a benefit cost ratio, and if you think that the pledge has generated another $151 million, which it has, right? In sort of incremental commitments that were not originally in the original pledge. We've generated that $151 million through 2 years of $151,000 budgets. My calculation, that's a 500 to 1 return. 151 million with $300,000 spent over 2 years. That's extraordinary. And we could do so much more if we had, 500,000 a year to spend, because then we could recruit so many more companies, and we could do some of these more in-depth follow-ups of a subset of those companies to really learn about what's working, what's not working, what can the rest of us do to help those companies do more, and what capacities do they lack internally that's stopping them doing more. Because don't forget, the companies that are in our group, as Carin said, they're not doing it because it's a big favor to the world. They're doing it because it makes business sense to them. Now, they are more motivated than many others to do something about hunger, but we're making it relatively easy for them to do it. So we could do so much more, 500 to 1 benefit cost ratio, if we had more money to recruit companies, socialize them, construct their initial pledges and their initial matrices, identify with them where they can do more, work with them to design the actions, and then get a third party to evaluate what's actually happened. This is peanuts, honestly. And I think it's a real shame that we haven't been able to attract more investment to help with the mechanics of running this thing, because you don't get many 500 to 1 investments around. Back to you, Mark.
It's true. It's It's not easy to come across a 500 to 1 investment case. And thank you, Lawrence, for sharing that, because it ushers us into the next segment where we're going to talk about scaling up. I'm going to start with you, Carin. The report reminds us that the world still needs over 500 billion US dollars to end hunger by 2030. And that's not a small gap, it's a huge gap, given the current circumstances that we are operating in. How do we scale from millions to billions? I think this is something that Lawrence also mentioned earlier. How do we scale from millions to billions?
I mean, this is the big decades-long development question. How do we scale from, I think the last time the UN convened the finance community, it was around scaling from billions to trillions, because the investment gap to solve all the world's problems are in the trillions. We're a bit more modest here. We're trying to solve the hunger, malnutrition problem, where the problem can be solved with billions. But as you say, I mean, we were involved in a recent study that found we need an additional $514 billion between now and 2030, less than 5 years away, to end hunger. And we've only got 800 million so far in private sector commitment. Now, it is true that the public sector will and should play the greatest role, but there's no way we're going to fill that gap with public money alone. And so for me, the really big challenge, and it's one we're trying to address through this pledge, is how can we use public money better to make markets work so that the private sector is functioning properly and investing the way it should. Investing so that we don't need a pledge to get them to invest, but because things are functioning so well that they are investing anyway and seeing opportunities. And that's where we really need to go. I mean, there are very fancy words to talk about it. We talk about blending and leveraging and catalytic aid. But I think at its heart, it's about how you use scarce public money better, whether that's domestic budgets or coming from foreign aid budgets. How do we use this scarce and shrinking public money to make the market work so that the markets fix the problems better? And I would say, therefore, that it's not just about more private sector investment, but it's about better private sector investment. So it's as much about more money as about the quality of the money. And the quality of the money will only improve if there's proper government regulation in place to discipline the baddies and stop them being bad and allow the goodies to flourish. And I'm not going to say who the baddies and who the goodies are. But you know, a goodie today can become a baddie tomorrow because the government regulation allows bad behavior to be prevalent in the market. What we have been championing through the pledge is really the role of the small and medium enterprises. More than 2/3 of our companies are small and medium enterprises, and that is the backbone of the economies. That is the 3 million companies employing 20 people or more that Lawrence spoke about. GAIN has this wonderful facility called N3F, which I'm a huge fan of, that is trying to make loans to SMEs to help them get off the ground. High risk, okay, they're going where no commercial investor will go. They're going where no other commercial bank will go. The development banks won't even go there. But GAIN is going there with this facility and trying to get these SMEs, what I like to call the missing middle, the finance that they need to operate in the market in a way that delivers the kinds of benefits that farmers need, that consumers need, and that well-functioning markets need. But, and I think Lawrence would agree with me, N3F is a drop in the ocean. We need $540 billion extra money flowing. SMEs alone need an additional $160 billion a year. So initiatives like ours, like the Pledge or like N3F again, are never going to be enough to get to that scale. And so I think we need the development banks, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, the World Bank, to step up, to take more risks, to go where no other commercial bank will go, and to start providing the finance that this missing middle needs. And then I think we will have the scaling that we want.
Yeah, thank you, Carin. Lawrence, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just to say I agree with that completely. We need to scale the funding, but to do that, we need to scale the ideas, the mindset that small amounts of ODA, and let's face it, they're dwindling, so they're becoming very precious. We need to use those to leverage much bigger resource flows. And where are the big resource flows? They're in the private sector, and they're in the international finance institutions and the development finance institutions. And to some extent, they're in the climate space as well. And so we need to use ODI to leverage those amounts of resources. We saw very clearly what happened to the food system during COVID-19. The food system shut down. Why did it shut down? Workers were getting sick. Food system workers were getting sick. SMEs couldn't weather the storm. They had no reserves, unlike the bigger companies. And the food markets had to close down because the infrastructure was so poor, it wasn't protecting its consumers and its vendors sufficiently well. And that kind of gives you a sense of the role of the private sector. Now, public, private, blended finance, call it what you will, but using small amounts of philanthropic or public money to leverage much larger amounts of private sector money has to be the way to go. We've been pushing on this for a while at GAIN. I think the rest of the world's going to catch up now because needs must as ODA diminishes. Let me just give you, so Carin kindly mentioned N3F, which is co-led by GAIN and Incofin, who's the fund manager. And yes, it's a proof of concept, basically. It's a $60 million, $80 million proof of concept. And if that works, if that seems to be getting traction, and we've already had a couple of companies repay us already. And these are not small loans. They're $200,000, $300,000 loans. If that proof of concept can be demonstrated, then we should be pushing the development banks, as you said, Carin, to implement these kinds of mechanisms, EFAD, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, the KFWs, the Propalcos, the FMOs of this world. They should be doing this kind of aggregation. They should be investing in funds and creating funds, because sometimes to get from millions to billions, you have to go through hundreds of thousands. And it's the hundreds of thousands that are the bottleneck for many of these big players. So we need to find institutional innovations that help them do that. The other thing that I think is really an incredible opportunity, and I don't quite know whether the pledge is a place to go for this, but is getting better nutrition for workers. I mean, I mentioned the number of employers in operating in Africa. I think it was about 3 million. So they have at least 20 employees. So that's 60 million employees. If you take the minimum, it's probably more like 300 or 400 million employees. If we can get better nutrition to them, that improves the bottom line of those companies. It's an empirical fact. Healthier workers, less absenteeism, higher productivity, more loyalty, less turnover, fewer accidents. This all accumulates in the bottom line of the company. But companies are reluctant to set these programs up because there are some initial costs to doing so, and they don't know if it's going to improve their bottom line or not. So this is where philanthropy and the public sector can come in and provide that initial startup funding that then sets this massive private sector financing train in motion. So we need to start being really creative about the private sector and the public sector, what the private sector can do and what it can't do, and what governments and development finance institutions need to do differently in this very different landscape.
Yeah, thank you, Lawrence. Definitely partnerships and many other wonderful things that have been mentioned. I want us to now, as we wrap up, focus on something a bit more inspirational for all of us who are working in this industry, obviously also our audience. Carin, something personal, what keeps you motivated leading this work? I know you have done quite a lot over the years. There's a lot under your belt, so to speak, but what really motivates you to continue doing this work?
So what Lawrence knows about me, but you don't, is I was actually born and I grew up in South Africa during apartheid. And whilst my accent doesn't give my South African nationality away, it is where I'm from, even though, and again, your listeners won't know this because they're hearing us, not seeing us, but I'm a white South African. So I was one of those that benefited from apartheid. And that's what really motivates me, is that struggle against injustice, inequality, and that fight to give everybody an equal chance to succeed, to prosper, to thrive, to live without hunger and malnutrition. And my childhood is what motivates me, and it continues today to motivate everything that I do. And I'm now in a place where I don't want that injustice and that inequality to end through handouts. I want it to end because things are working the way they should. Government is playing their role, and there is a thriving private sector in Africa that is able to provide for the needs of the population.
Thank you, Carin. And I believe you also worked in Tanzania, if I'm not wrong. I did some digging. Lawrence, what gives you hope when you think about the future of the pledge?
For me, Mark, what drives me forward is when I was a very young man, some of my initial work was in breadbasket areas of a country where most of the country's food was produced. And despite that, everyone I came across in the villages was hungry. And this, very clearly disabuses you of the notion that food production equals hunger reduction. Yes, it's important because it generates not just food, but it generates income and jobs. But when you think about hunger and malnutrition, you quickly begin to realize it's about justice. It's about where you were born, where you happen to have been born, into which context you happen to have been born, and the opportunities you have to get out of that. So that's what radicalized me, really. And what gives me hope is, no matter how hard it gets for us, it's infinitely harder for people who don't know where the next meal is going to come from and who have to feed their kids. And they don't even talk about putting food on the table because they don't even have a table, many of them. So that always fortifies me and gives me strength to know if they can fight through this, then we can fight through this. I think this period of vandalism is the only thing I can think of to call it. It's vandalism against development. As I think aid is dead as we know it, but I think it's going to come back. And I think it's going to come back. It already is coming back in a different form, in the way Carin and I have been talking about it. A much more resilient form. Development itself has to become more resilient. It's become too dependent on aid and too dependent on a few big players. So the development process has to become more resilient. Governments have to step up. IFIs, DFIs have to step up. The private sector has to step up. And all of us have to think differently. Doing aid the way it was going in the last 30 years, it was always going to sunset. But this is now forcing us in a painful way to rethink development. And I think we're going to come out of it with a stronger paradigm that's more resilient and less vulnerable to future vandalism, because there will be future vandalism, but it's going to be more resilient to that, and therefore more resilient for the people who are at the sharp end of all of this, who don't know when their next meal is going to come, and they don't know what's going to be in it, and they don't know if it's going to be safe. They don't know if they're going to be able to drink clean water or get health care for their kids. So they don't even know if they're going to be around in the next month to take care of their kids. So that gives me hope, knowing that we're going to make a more resilient development system, and that no matter how sorry we may feel for ourselves, there's people who are struggling successfully to get through much heavier burdens than we do.
Yeah, thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, Carin, also for the wonderful insights that both of you have provided today. This has been such an insightful discussion. We've covered what the Zero Hunger Pledge is, what the 2023-2024 accountability report revealed, how investments are shaping food systems and how we can scale those up, and what it will take to scale these efforts into something truly transformative. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you want to explore the full accountability report, it's available online, so you can do a quick search and read more on what we've just talked about. I've been your host, Mark Gachagua, and this has been Bite the Talk. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. Stay safe and eat healthy.